Turning back now to our coverage of former President Trump's historic second impeachment trial. Senators will gather later today to consider whether to convict the former president of incitement of insurrection after a mob of his supporters stormed the U.S. Capitol January 6th. Prosecutors argue the former president's attempt to overturn election results is the most grievous constitutional crime. Meanwhile, Mr. Trump's lawyers insist their client is not guilty of the charge. So for more insight on this, let's bring in CBS News legal contributor Rebecca Roiphe. Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us. So we know that the first day today, what we're going to hear is an argument about the constitutionality of the entire process. Not about even whether what the president did made him guilty or not guilty, but whether or not this should be happening at all. What are you going to be listening out for?
So what's interesting here is the legal arguments. You're going to listen for President Trump's lawyers focusing on Article 4, Section 2 of the Constitution, and they are going to say, look, this is a mechanism of removal. This is a mechanism to remove the president from office. The Constitution says upon impeachment, the president shall be removed. And if he's no longer in office, then he can't be removed. So obviously, this is unconstitutional. The comeback to that is going to be, look, that's only part of the story. The Constitution in Article 1, Section 3 provides that disqualification is another remedy. So essentially, removal from office is like the minimum sentence, and that there's this additional possible consequence for impeachable conduct, for high crimes and misdemeanors. And it would be rendered essentially meaningless if the Congress were barred from trying a former president, because somebody could just immediately step down the minute that they were impeached to avoid the disqualification consequence. And that would make this whole part of the Constitution irrelevant. So looking at that, looking at history, looking at the bulk of evidence, I think most scholars at this point agree, not all, but most scholars agree that trying a former president for disqualification for office is constitutional. The question is, how will this convince other senators? So there was already a vote that Rand Paul brought to the floor, and the vote was 55 to 45. So will more senators be convinced as more legal scholars have come forward with different arguments? And the weight of the arguments does seem to be on the side of this being constitutional. But again, this is a sort of quasi-legal political proceeding, so it's hard to tell whether any of those Republican senators will be convinced by these new legal arguments.
So, Rebecca, one of the former president's key legal arguments, as we've been talking about, is Mr. Trump's speech. And everything said to his supporters is protected by the First Amendment. In the very influential Supreme Court case, which I know you're familiar with, Brandenburg v. Ohio, justices ruled that the government can suppress speech that is designed to produce imminent lawless action and is likely to do so. So does the president's speech meet that standard?
Well, so, that's an interesting question. There are two issues first. The first question is whether that standard applies to impeachment at all. And then the question is whether President Trump's conduct meets that standard. So let's start with the second one first. So if the president were charged criminally, I think there's a strong debate about whether or not his speech would be protected from criminal liability. So the First Amendment guarantee of free speech does protect certain speech and prevents the government from criminally convicting someone for speech that doesn't immediately incite violence. And so, there would be a question, and I think scholars on both sides have very good points, and I think we are rightfully concerned about throwing people in jail, private citizens in jail for political speech. And that's why in Brandenburg, it was really, really awful. He stood up there in a, Ku Klux Klan hood. He talked about how we should forcibly remove African Americans, send them back to Africa, and remove Jews and send them back to Israel, and, said there should be revengeance. There was certainly, awful speech, but the Supreme Court said this is not the kind of thing in America we put somebody in jail for. So, that's a significant question, but it's a little bit distracting from the issue here, because the real issue here is, does that even even apply to an impeachment. An impeachment is not a criminal proceeding. It is essentially has to do with job qualifications. And so, it isn't clear to me that that's the appropriate standard here, especially because when you think about it, government employees all the time are fired for and not hired because of controversial speech or even not particularly controversial speech. And so the idea that the president should be protected here in this kind of speech is somewhat odd. And if you think about the logical consequence of it, I mean, what if you had a president who stood up and was like, I think we should turn this country into like a, constitutional dictatorship and kind of vaguely urged citizens to take up arms. I think that would be clearly impeachable conduct, though it might be protected speech if we were to try to, convict that person, that president, criminally once he left office.
That's interesting. Rebecca, I think we're having like a little issue with your video, but we're going to keep on going because we can hear you loud and clear. So in an interview with Fox News Sunday this past weekend, Senator Rand Paul said that he expects Mr. Trump's lawyers to play clips of remarks made by Democrats that he says are comparable to, the remarks made by the president at his rally. This is sort of similar to what you were just bringing up. I want to play a clip of Rand Paul in that interview.
I think you're going to see the Trump defense play video of Maxine Waters telling crowds to mob Trump administration in restaurants and attack them. They'll probably show clips of Cory Booker saying, get up in their face of these Congress people. I think you're going to see all of this, and people are going to have to judge for themselves. Are we going to impeach and potentially criminally prosecute people for political speech when they say, get up and fight for your country, let your voices be heard?
So the former president's legal brief points to a statement from then House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi at a 2018 news conference about the Trump administration's zero tolerance policy on immigration, about why there aren't uprisings in the country. What do you make of this argument? And how does it fare next to their argument that the former president's words were taken out of context?
I think it's useful in pointing out that political speech can be really incendiary. And that's part of, what we were just talking about that standard established by the Supreme Court in Brandenburg versus Ohio. We want to be careful not to criminalize that kind of speech. But, it is, again, a different question whether or not somebody can be impeached for it. And another different question is, it's all very contextual, whether something is sort of hyperbole and just incendiary speech or whether something's actually inciting violence is a factual question. And one of the things you look at to establish whether or not you think it actually incited violence is what ultimately happened. I mean, we prosecutors, I'm a former prosecutor, and what you often do is you say, you look at what ultimately happened in order to help you prove intent. And I mean, here it's not only that it happened, it's that there were actors who knew along the way. So when you think about Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, he said prior to the Capitol riots, if we keep moving in this direction, if the president keeps using this rhetoric and keeps insisting on the lie that the election was stolen, there is going to be violence. And so in a certain way, the president was on notice that this was going to happen, that this could happen, and that it was concerning. And so, I think it really is different from that, kind of incendiary speech. But, that's a factual question. And it depends on whether or not the senators are convinced by it. To me, it seems different because of what ultimately happened, what Trump supporters were saying about why they did it, and how that was foreseeable and foreseen.
So
let me ask you this question. You brought up Raffensperger, and I was saying to Vlad that it seems to me that perhaps, and I'm clearly not an expert in this area, a stronger argument would have been some sort of an abuse of power argument, because we have recordings of the president pressuring election officials in Georgia to find more votes. To me, that is kind of like a straight line when it comes to a behavior that a president should not be participating in. That is an abuse of power.
Yeah.
Instead,
Yeah,
we hear the argument about his speech. So yeah, I want to get your take on that.
Right. I mean, I don't know about the inner workings and why they opted to go with the incitement rather than focusing on that particular event. I think, as far as I can tell, probably the reasoning went something like this. If we go with a broader charge, first of all, we can bring in more evidence. So it's like, if we go with the broader sense of incitement, that whole incident will be relevant anyway. But it's a simpler argument. It's a simpler core theory. Look, here's what happened. Here's what happened over a long period of time. Here are the various different times in which President Trump did this, and you can use all of the evidence as opposed to focusing on one incident like the phone call to Ukraine, right? It can sometimes distract from the broader story, and my guess is that what the House managers wanted to do was to be able to tell the broader story to the American public and, hopefully convince those 17 senators. But if not, at least leave the American public with this story in their head, with the images in their head of the Capitol riot and the people who were storming the Capitol saying over and over again that they were doing it for and at the behest of the president.
Yeah, I mean, Rebecca, the other thing that I'm curious about is, as Anne-Marie was just alluding to, are all the statements that the president made leading up to January the 6th. I know that they're going to show video of these people storming the Capitol. I know they're going to show video of people holding Blue Lives Matter flags and beating police officers with them. But, one of the things that I'm very curious about is, are they able to introduce the numerous statements made by the president before the election, that if he didn't win the election, it would be because it was rigged. Of course, if he won the election, everything's perfect. The Republicans who won their re-election or who actually made gains in the House of Representatives, that's all legit. But anybody who lost, specifically the president, well, then it's a rigged election. It's a fake, I'm just curious if they're able to use that, because I know that a lot of people have said, well, they're not going to have witness testimony here, but you don't really need it when you have all that video and you have days and days and days of the president of the United States undermining the electoral process.
Yeah, I would not be surprised to see that come in. I mean, the whole point here is they're thinking, how do we develop what in law is called a core theory? How do we tell one story so that it remains in the heads of the people who are watching? And, what you just told is exactly that. I mean, it's a narrative. It's a story that is convincing and upsetting and plays on people's emotions, and that's what they're going to try to do. The problem with the first impeachment, and I think the lesson that they learned, was it was too technical, right? We got caught in the technical details of something instead of looking at a broader picture. They tried, right? They tried to say abuse of power in order to interfere with the election, but it got caught up in these tiny little details, and that's what they don't want. They want to be able to just focus the camera back. And so, as you said, I think it'd be really good to start earlier because the story starts earlier. It's one long story leading up to this moment, and it undermines that effort that the Republicans are going to try to make, which I think, it's not strategically wrong to focus on how political speech can be like this. People can really get worked up and say things, and it would be ridiculous to impeach somebody every time he or she did that. But you have to say this is different. And how do you do that? Exactly the way you just said, Vlad, which is tell this story in a way that convinces people and brings them along in how it developed and how it really seemed like it was intentional, because it wasn't just, one heated speech. It was many, many leading up to this thing. And he was warned, and he knew, and other people knew that this could happen.
Rebecca Roiphe, always great to have you. And Rebecca, just so you know, the fact that you just gave some, credibility to my legal theory argument there means I can expect numerous text messages from my mom about why didn't I go to law school. Can't you see? You would have been a great lawyer.
Maybe we can, Vlad, maybe we can get you an honorary degree.
She would love that. Oh, man, make her day. Rebecca Roiphe, thank you very much, as always. We appreciate it.